like this, man. He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down in the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's like all the time.
All right, Braxton McCoy, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
Doing good, man. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, man, I'm glad to have you. This was set up by our mutual friend Bird, and I really appreciate that. But just if you could you give us kind of a quick sketch of who you are and what you do?
Yeah, well, the what you do part's got a little bit more complicated as of late, but I grew up on a little horse place in southern Utah, and then I moved up to Idaho after the war. I was invited up here and ended up working up here as a guide for a while, and then it just worked out where it was kind of better leaving a young family for 3 months at a time to go guide mule and deer hunts was kind of it just wasn't going to work out. So we bought a place up here, and so for a long time I guided in the fall and broke colts all summer or spring and summer, and now it's a lot more media stuff, but still got colts and that stuff, but I'm not doing day work and things like that I used to do anymore. Kind of that gap has been filled a little bit. And quickly, I got to tell you this because it's been so weird. My wife and I have been having conversations about some opportunities have been presented as of late, and we're trying to decide what to do, and obviously you want to talk to your wife. And I was telling her, like, isn't this crazy? COVID happened and we lost about 25% of our annual always came from public speeches, like motivational corporate stuff. And then all those got canceled overnight. And I had spent, a decade or so being very careful. Well, maybe not that long. Anyway, years being careful about what I ever said online. And then they canceled all this stuff. And I was actually sitting in a cabin barn. We were fall cabin. And I wanted to start dunking on politicians. We were bored trying to stay awake late at night. And so I started kind of dunking on politicians. And now I have like people that are running for pretty high office talking to me on the phone, asking me if I want to come work for them and stuff like that, So as far as like what we do now, I'm still riding horses, and we're still a little bit less than I used to, but we're still doing that. And now I kind of have this I'm in a bit of a weird transitionary period. I apologize for rambling at you.
Oh, not at all, man. So I actually want to talk to you about horses, right? Because I'm on the East Coast. I have a little bit of agriculture experience because one of my good friends, his family owns a large cattle farm, 400 head of cows, and as you can imagine, right, they need help. So every couple months I go out, help them with what they need. That's pretty limited experience. And at least where I am, horses are it's like an expensive plaything for rich people, right? It's like the country club set. And, from what I'm gathered, right, that's somewhat different where you are.
Yeah, it's very different. In fact, I've got a lot of buddies that are farming in the Midwest and raising cattle, and so they're ranching and farming out there, and they tease me all the time about horses. But in fact, like, hi Tristan, we talked about this the other day. I mean, let's see you run that 4-wheeler up the mountain, So when we have to go gather and they're out on summer pasture, a lot of times it's like, well, depending on which place you're working for, a lot of times it's like a 100,000 acre. Sometimes it's a lot bigger than that. I just don't want to sound ridiculous here, but it's like 100,000 acre spread. And these cattle are anywhere between 9 and 5,000 feet up, and they ledge themselves in. And I mean, they do all those kind of cattle things, but it's on a really big area. And frankly, there's just places that you couldn't, even if you were willing to break the law and, run stuff across BLM ground that you probably shouldn't, you couldn't actually get to them without a horse. And that's to say nothing of trying to rope and doctor and that kind of stuff in a big area.
Yeah, you actually bring up an interesting point, right? Which is BLM land. which is something that we just don't have here. And obviously that affects agriculture, but I'm also a little bit jealous because shooting at any distance at all on this side of the Mississippi is somewhat difficult. I have access to a princely, it's not even a private range, it's a field, right, with stakes marked out, and it goes all the way to 600, which is considered quite the accomplishment here. Very different on BLM land. So could you explain, right, for the viewers who may not be familiar, what the relationship is between you guys running cows and then the Bureau of Land Management?
Yeah, I'm glad. Actually, let me start by saying I'm really glad that you used the word jealous, because usually the biggest hurdle for me talking to people on the other side of the river is getting them to understand how good of a thing it is that we still have these. It is. I mean, these, when I say these, I'm talking about these public lands. It is in some sense a socialist project and all of that. I would argue that we have plenty of other things to deal with before we start ruining these. Boy, this is like a near and dear one to my heart, so it's hard not to go off on. Okay,
no, don't pull your punches here. We're not exactly. No one will be offended if you like BLM here. But.
Okay. Well, and there's
the phrasing on that came out wrong, but you know what I meant.
I do. Yeah, the BLM, not BLM, right? Yeah. Well, it's a love-hate relationship with them, right? We've been dealing with them our whole lives. In fact, when I was a kid, one of the pastures that we ran our mares and colts on was a BLM allotment, and so we've been dealing with them for at least my family and all these many of these families out here have been dealing with them forever, and that can be difficult, especially particularly if you get a range conservation officer that is a pain in the butt. It can be pretty tough. But the fact is, small family farms out here, even something like 400 head, you could probably 400 head. Okay, so where we're at, it takes so much ground. There's a thing, you're familiar with the term stalking rate?
Yes.
Okay. So the stalking rate out here is, it ranges anywhere between like a pair per, now I'm talking non-irrigated, anywhere between like a pair per 10 to a pair per 100, depending on which part of it. I'm not quite so familiar with the lower ground over Emmett, Ada County type stuff over there. But on our side, man, you're looking at a pair per, let's talk my valley specifically. You're going to need about 30 to 75 acres per pair, probably at least, to be profitable. So you can just imagine how much ground it would take to run a 400 head operation. And then if you try to like pencil that in the inverse, you can quickly see that with like California and that kind of money moving in, these grounds are, the grass stuff is no longer anywhere even remotely profitable. It really kind of never was, but at least you could make the note. And now you absolutely can't make the note. So these small guys, without those BLM allotments, they're done. They are cooked,
So two things I want to get into. One, just to provide people some context. In my neck of the woods, right, Virginia, this is an average, right? So it could be different, but the average stocking rate is 1 to 2 cows per acre, right? Versus 100 acres, right? So it's significantly different. But one thing that from my limited experience seems to be true is that, purely from an economic standpoint, farmers are getting hit hard, right? All of the incentives are lining up for consolidation, right? Towards bigger and bigger farms owned by more and more people. And a big part of that, at least from the guys I know, is the cost of capital, right? The cost of the stuff you need to buy. Obviously, tractors matter more or less depending on where you are. But I'm curious, right? Have you seen that same squeeze where you are? And if not, how are the small guys doing, at least business wise?
Yeah, they're getting squeezed hard. Just to be totally frank, we're amongst friends here, so I don't think anyone's gonna flip and vote Kamala. But the tariffs hit our region particularly hard, especially for the small guys. Just a personal anecdote: we were going to build an indoor riding arena on our place. This was about 4 or 5 years ago. Gosh, time gets away from you, but maybe it's 7 years ago now. And we had priced it out. It was going to cost me roughly 75 for the building. And I was going to do a lot of the erecting of it. It would have ended up somewhere around 110 when we were done. When the tariff hit within a month, that $75,000 building had went from 75 to like 125. Now it came back down some. I think people were just trying to prepare to see what it was going to actually look like on the other end. As far as when I say people, the guys that are producing the metal buildings. But that made that like totally, it made that way, way out of reach as far as like anything that could be profitable for us within like 10 years. So that put a probably $30,000 squeeze on our place, because if I can ride for 2-3 more months a year, I can put about an extra 30 grand at that time in our bank. So that's just an anecdotal example of the squeeze. The cattle producers are feeling it the same way. They're doing their best to keep up, but COVID didn't help. And right now, cattle prices are really high, and like, okay, that can be good when you're at the sell barn, but when you're, if you're in a situation where you've got to pick up, if you're a cow calf guy, if you're in a situation where you've got to pick up replacement heifers or stuff like that, or particularly even worse, the guys that were running like feeders or steers or anything like that. Those guys, I mean, they're having a really tough go right now. I mean, to be frank, steers were always kind of a casino. Without getting too much in the weeds, it's been pretty tough on guys out here too. And then you add in on top of that the water curtailment issues that we had, which were largely political. It's been rough out here. And without the BLM, to kind of full circle on that, as much as we hate them, without the BLM, a lot of these guys would have been in big trouble. The small guys, especially, as you say, all the incentives are aligned. I don't want to name any names in particular because I've got to work with these people on some stuff. But yeah, well, I can say something like Monsanto, for example, right? Everything is aligned in their direction because they've got enough capital. They can absorb a lot of damage. The guy that's just barely scraping by, no matter how well he manages the funds on his place, he cannot absorb the type of hit that they can.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate here, right? And I'm going to ask, look, me, the American consumer, why should I care, right? If a small farm goes out of business, a big farm buys them out, won't that make it more efficient for me? Won't I get my product at a cheaper rate?
Couple things on that. I think we have to be honest with ourselves. Probably, maybe. Maybe. I mean, you can go buy cheaper tools at Harbor Freight, right? So maybe, but long term, this is the fastest pathway to be eating bugs, these huge operations, they're actually not, they don't really care. So here's another dirty secret that people don't like to say. If you're a farm and ranch at a large enough scale, you're probably not making all that good of money relatively speaking. You're probably not making all that good of money off your cattle anyway. You're probably making more off of your row crop stuff. No one likes to talk about it, but it is true. So eventually, say, Bugman Gates gets control of a whole bunch of stuff and then squeezes the market and all the dead or small guys are dead. I mean, yeah, now beef is like just trying to buy a burger at McDonald's is like Wagyu prices, so that would be like one thing I would say. And the second would be like, I don't know, man, I love my people. So I know it's like when the Teamster guy, and this is just more of I'm admitting that probably this is an emotional argument. Okay. I'll just admit that the Teamster guy pissed everybody off, pissed me off too. But the fact is, I love my people. So I've watched I've watched in my lifetime it go from a guy could have about 150, 200 head out here. Usually his wife was a school teacher, something like that, able to make ends meet, raise a family, never wealthy, to if you have 150 head and that's all you've got, you are absolutely sunk. So I've already seen that happen. And I just would rather it not become you've got to have 1,000 head to even put a kid through public school. We're not even talking like going to Harvard or something. You know what I mean?
Well, and honestly, look, here's my perspective on it, right? Is like, would I rather live in a place where burgers are 20 cents cheaper or where good people can have good paying, decent jobs, right? Like, look, like I get it. You know, all of us are on the right wing. A lot of us kind of went through that libertarian stage, right? But to me, it's like you can justify a lot of things by what is the most efficient, right? Like shipping off your grandma to die in a nursing home is way more efficient, right, than actually taking care of her. You know, all these things are, yeah, sure, they make more sense from a dollars and, you know, pure monetary dollars and cents perspective, right? But it's like at a certain point, like you have to live here, right? And you don't just live by yourself as a guy, right? You live in a community around other people. And fundamentally, and I think this is really one of the kind of positive developments of the last 10 to 15 years, is a realization from kind of conservative people on the right that like, look, like we want good jobs for people who aren't like laptop class, right? We want decent jobs. And I think that, you know, when you compare that to the alternative of, yeah, food prices might be higher, it's like, well, guess what? Yeah, there's no free lunch, literally in this case. But fundamentally, right, like if you want to live in a nice place, you might have to give something up. You know, you see this with immigration too, right? It's probably cheaper for you to get your house built by, you know, slave labor, right? By imported Guatemalans. But that has other costs, right? That aren't apparent in that simple economic transaction. Because the dollars that are going to that guy aren't going to someone else who probably needs that job and is actually from here. And so to me, like I asked a question that I was setting it up for you, right? As a softball. But to me, it's like at a certain point, like there's a lot more to having a country than just having an economy that's, you know, 2% more efficient than last year.
Yeah, I think that's right. If you will, let me say two things right here. And this first one is going to be, so one of the dumbest things I've ever written on Twitter was a thing that I should have just kept in my head, but it was taken out of context. And,
many such cases. Yeah, we've all been there.
So we were sitting on my buddy's porch, and something had come across my timeline, and I was talking about the border, and I was like, yeah, we got to lock the fucking border down. Sorry, I apologize for cursing. We got to lock the border down. This is absolutely ridiculous, you know, and so on. But I've got a guy here. Turns out he wasn't even actually illegal, but we all thought he was illegal. Been in our community for 40 years. There's a handful of people like this. And when I said that, in my mind, I was talking about one single person, and I was literally talking about a community that would be like, hey, at the point of a gun, you're not taking this guy out of here, which would be like 200 people in the country. You know what I mean? This is not like, but it was a stupid thing. I shouldn't have said it. But I stand by the loyalty to a friend, even though he turned out to be legal. So I want to put that out there because I know a lot of your listeners know me from that, and they're going to think I'm being hypocritical here. I really worded that badly, and I guess I apologize. I apologize for the way I worded it, and then also the way I handled the argument. That part I will apologize for. I shouldn't have been such a dick, but I agree with everything you're saying. This, you know, I can get my house for $1 a square foot cheaper built. By the way, they're going to do a shitty job too. So there's like secondary effects or secondary costs to this that a lot of people are not thinking about. We cannot allow for that anymore. And then the second thing, which I think is actually more important, is like when I was a kid, I started day working, totally normal for kids out here. No, that's not anything out of the realm of the ordinary. Day working under the table. If you're lucky, you're getting $3 to $5 an hour when you're a kid at that age, back in, this would be like the 90s and I guess it'd be mostly the 90s and then the early 2000s. You're not making anything, the guy that's paying you doesn't have to worry about, you're not on his payroll. He's not worried about insurance, all this other stuff. It's basically like, okay, in some sense, that kid is working as a slave. But here's the part that no one ever talks about is now he's developed real skills. He's learning how to do a job. It's like a stepping stone job is also removed from our young, white native or whatever Native American kids,
Well, I mean, we used to just call this being an apprentice, right? Where it was like, you're the gopher. You don't get paid a lot. But, like the old salty dude at the shop shows you what to do. And you do that for a couple of years and then you're useful, And like, one of the things you hear a lot about, right, is, and you're a little bit older than me. You're a millennial. I'm Gen Z, but this applies even more to my generation than yours, right? But is the guy who doesn't know how to do anything, right? And in certain communities on the internet, this is like weirdly a badge of pride. But you see the kind of negative on YouTube, right? Where it's like, there are all these channels dedicated to dad advice, right? Like, how do you hang up a picture frame? How do you change a tire? And I don't begrudge anyone for either making that kind of content or watching it, right? Obviously, if you don't know, learn. But it speaks to a lack of those kind of training institutions. And certainly some of that is dad advice, right? It's familial, father to son, grandfather to grandson. But I think another part of it is, what were your first jobs? Right? What are the things you did where you didn't make a lot of money, that provided a skill to you? And I think that you're 100% right. Like, when that goes out to the lowest common denominator, basically slave labor, right? You're not only, making that a permanent thing where that guy is now stuck with that level of job forever, but, to all the guys who would have passed through that, they don't really have that opportunity anymore.
Yeah, right. And we saw some of this in the GWAT too. So when we got to Iraq, I don't want to say what unit because I'm going to say not necessarily polite things, but we were a guard unit and we replaced an active infantry unit. And when we got there, the facilities that these guys were living in were terrible. We had taken when I say we, I mean the greater we, the Army had taken over an old Iraqi military base and turned it into a FOB. So these guys were living in like these barracks. Well, we got there and there's all these big open bays and all of that. And we wanted we're going to be here for 14 months or whatever. We wanted some semblance of privacy and everything was on, 240 European power or whatever. And so, my stepdad was also an electrician, so I had learned at least some basic skills there. And then a friend of mine was an electrical apprentice going through college, and so he and I went through and split up the 240 and made American outlets through the whole thing. And then we built these little bays for everybody. They were all like 7x9 or something, basically like little prison cells, but it was at least somewhere where you could have like your own space. And we were able to do all of that as a bunch of, 18, 19. If you were old, you were 25 at the time, you know what I mean? And we could do all of that. And even the active Army guys, either they were too lazy or didn't, more likely didn't actually have any of that background. So you actually are building a more well-rounded person. There's trade-offs to everything. Okay. There's slave laboring and all that, but they come out more of a generalist, which is, by the way, kind of like part of the American tradition is being a generalist guy. You may not be the best at like all this stuff. And you have your thing that you're supposed to be good at, but you're also supposed to be like competent, particularly if you're like a man from the West. You're supposed to be competent in all of these other areas. And the only way that happens is if somebody lets you work for really cheap. You don't learn how to do that without that opportunity.
Yeah, just to just a brief anecdote, right? That reminded me of a great story about me and my grandfather, right? Who's still alive, classic American story, right? He was feral, right? He didn't have his mom abandoned him, was living in the trash, got adopted by a 4'8" redheaded boot seller from Oklahoma, right? Looked like Yosemite Sam, you know, went into the military, got out, always worked with his hands. And he was probably 70 at the time. And I get a call from him and he's like, "Hey, I need you to help me with something. I got to put up a garage door." I'm like, "Okay, how hard can that be?" And I go over there and I realize that he has cut a hole through a supporting beam in their house so that he could put a garage door on the basement door. And he is standing there with a new support beam made out of wood, like overhead pressing it, largely unplussed. He's like, "All right, I need a second set of hands for this." I was like, "Grandpa, come on." When you were literally holding the house up to tell me this with some urgency. Because I like stopped at McDonald's on the way. I was just, when I assumed that was a casual invitation, right? Not there is a hole in the house. I need you to help me. And so the point is, right, it's a humorous anecdote, right? But it does show you that even within, recent history, that kind of generalist knowledge, right? Where he never worked construction, but he built houses, right? He learned how to do things. And I had a really good experience with a friend who's been on the show a couple times, and another one of my best friends when I was in college, right, where we ended up in a very similar situation, right, where it's like we are stuck here, we need to get something done. And I think that especially in kind of the generation of helicopter parents, right, where people didn't have a lot of kids, they put a lot of pressure that each kid was turn out well and never be harmed or at any way at risk. That mentality of just like, well, we'll figure it out, I think is really necessary, particularly for men, but also just for building that skill set. Because, a lot of times, like, if you're never forced to learn it, you never will. Sorry, man, I'm rambling, but back to you.
No. Keep going. I was interested.
Point is, right, and this is actually something I wanted to talk to you about, right? Because, you are a millennial, and I think millennials have a curse of being the most analyzed generation ever. Right? Like if you type that phrase into Google, you'll get dozens and dozens of results. But I think something interesting is happening, right? In the sense that, there aren't a lot of, I don't even think there are really any millennials left in their 20s, right? The youngest are kind of in their 30s. A lot of them have kids. And, I'm curious, right? What do you see your generation becoming? Because from the outside in, it seems like you guys have split into two different species, right? That barely have anything in common one to another. And so I realize that's a broad question, but I'm curious to get your take on it.
Well, I actually think you nailed it with splitting into two different species thing. This happened with the boomers. We are basically, a lot of people are going to be upset by this, but we are basically the boomers of our era in a lot of ways. Now, we don't have it perhaps as economically easy as they did or whatever, but okay. So here's a way to think of it. Have you ever seen the movie Platoon? You're young. So.
Yes, I have.
Okay. So, Oliver Stone kind of memes on the boomer generation in that, right? He's got Elias and then he's got Bunny, and Bunny's the psychotic idiot redneck that's like ripping the top of beer cans off with his teeth and then, murdering people and whatever. And so Oliver's bias is clear there. And then the hippie side, the Elias can do no wrong, almost Christos figure of the movie happens to be like perfectly aligned with anyone who would have been at Woodstock. Right. Well, a lot of the people that we meme on from the boomer generation are, the Elias side. And a lot of the people from that generation were actually like Bunny. I mean, notice that Merle Haggard is played, and not just that, but like Merle Haggard's Fight Inside of Me song is played in that movie, if I remember correctly. And that is like a song about how America is worth fighting for. And, I'm a, even though I went to prison as a young man, I screwed up and this country give me a second chance and so on. It's like a true, like kind of an Americana song. And they meme on that in that movie. And I think our generation is sort of very much like that. We've got the AOC thing. 50% of the country thinks that she should just be put in charge of, you know, pick a cabinet position and then all the others, and she should probably be in it. And then somebody like Joe Kent, who I guess probably is a late Gen X, or he's right in there anyway. Somebody like him is this horrible, evil Nazi racist, but you look at him and he's just like this smiling, happy guy with beautiful children, despite all of the suffering he's been through and the load that he's actually carried for this country, which is significant. Okay, and some bunch of frogs are going to be upset that he did some of that for the CIA, but whatever. Like, I mean, this guy, like, so I think he, like, if we're going to make two people emblematic of each side, I would be happy to put Joe as kind of the figurehead of our side. And I think as far as like what will come out of this in the end, like how history will look back on my generation, I think it will depend on if and when people like Joe Kent and some of my friends are able to seize some power. What they do with it, then we'll find out. Maybe maybe we deserve a lot of the stuff they say about us, but I don't think the story's told yet.
Yeah, I think there's something to that, right? This is something I talk a lot about with my own generation, Gen Z, right? Is that, you know, our generations each had a crisis, right? You guys had 9/11, which I was technically alive for, although barely. And for us, it was COVID. Sorry, not trying to make you feel too old. But anyway, right? And each one of those crises, right, fundamentally changed society. You know, 9/11, right? Enough ink has been spilled on that, right? But I think that, you know, that period between 9/11 and COVID, right? It was wild. It was chaotic, but there was always at least like the idea that it could go back, quote unquote, to normal. You know, there was always that idea that we could go back to how it was before. And I think that after COVID, everyone realized like, oh no, we're stuck here. You know, that we're not going back to at least for the foreseeable future, right, to a polite time. And I think that you see that bifurcation, right, that splintering in young people right now. And obviously, like you're saying, there were two populations with millennials, right? You see this super strongly. And I think you're seeing it more and more based off of who decides to have kids, right? Like the difference between millennial parents and childless millennials is like two different planets. But one of the weird things that's happening to Gen Z, right, is that bifurcation still exists, but it's really heavily on gender lines, right? Like women are really liberal for Gen Z and men are really conservative, which is not a particularly healthy place to be. Obviously, you know, there are, you know, any number of exceptions to that rule. But to me, I think that that's kind of interesting, right? That, you know, we still have this, you know, generational warfare, right? Where, you know, the young people hate the old people, right? That's been the case for the last, you know, 70 years, right? But you have this additional level of like, well, now there's a knife fight going on within that cohort. And I didn't mean to turn this into a conversation.
No,
like that, but I think it's an interesting development.
Yeah, it's almost like one more step back, right? Like the first step back in some ways might be that just kids themselves are having kids and that are part of the problem. And then now it's like just getting married at all is part of the problem. And if I'm to believe the things I see on the TL, that's kind of coming as far as the not getting married part, that's kind of coming from both sides at this point, which is wild.
No, definitely. When I got married young, people looked at me like I was like getting a face tattoo. You know, it was not considered socially acceptable. But I actually want to go back and talk to you about the global war on terror, right? Because, you know, I grew up in it. One of my very first memories, I think, yeah, this would be the right time, would have been the the build up to the invasion of Iraq. Like I remember watching that on television at a pretty young age. And, you know, I guess from being kind of fully on the outside, right? You know, I knew people who were older than me who went or had gone. But it seemed very, very far away. So can you speak to, you know, that moment, right? Let's go to the start. Where were you on 9/11?
I was a junior in high school, and this is probably not going to shock anybody, but I was not a great high school student. I would like keep my grades up good enough to be able to play sports, you know, wrestling season, baseball, that kind of thing. So I was skipping school, and I was at my cousin's house, and school got canceled, which worked out for me. So that didn't count as like a truancy deal. But we were sitting there, and you know, he turned on the TV. Everyone had a TV in their kitchen, and back then, which now is like an adult, I look back on and kind of, I think that's weird. I'm very glad that we don't have that, but we did back then. And cousin turned on the TV, and you know, CNN or Fox or whatever the heck was on. One of the towers was burning, and we watched the second plane hit the tower. And you know, everyone, you know, it sounds like a meme or something, but I don't know, man. I just knew, like, all right, well, I guess I know where I'm going to be for the next couple of years. So that was kind of the tenor with some people. Some people were just kind of like scared and in shock, and that carried, man. That carried for years. People would like not go to the mall. A lot of this has been retconned, and people forget. Like they were doing like it was color coded, you know, terrorist watch fear stuff. So if you wanted to go to the mall, the news would be like, you know, oh, it's an orange security day or whatever.
That's actually, it's weird you bring that up. I haven't thought about that. I remember that. Like I remember, it's when you said the mall, I remember walking through the mall, and it had like it's similar to the sign they use for wildfire now. Right.
Yeah.
It was like a color coded ranking.
Yeah. And how crazy is that in retrospect, you know? But that was, so people were living in fear. And of course, this is how you drum up support for invading something like Iraq, which was, we all know, like totally disconnected from 9/11. But the average young kid is like, okay, you tell me, or maybe not some young kids are like, you tell me who I got to go punch in the mouth. Like this is my response mechanism to things like that. So some of us just kind of gravitated to it. And, you know, and there's another part that like no one or very few people will want to be honest about. Like a lot of young men, I don't know if this has always been true, but it seems to be true. A lot of young men just kind of want to experience war. It's kind of hard coded into us. And it's like, okay, well, it's not the war. Maybe it's not the war we would want or whatever, but this is the war we got. So, you know, you just kind of go and join because that's the thing you wanted to do. And I think a lot of my generation kind of did that too. And okay, dumb, psyop, whatever. I mean, a certain type of person is going to gravitate to that, whether it's good or not. You know, it's just the way they're made.
No, I think you're right. A friend of mine, Thomas, has this way of explaining it, right? Where he talks about these kind of like it's rite of passage, right? At least, you know, classically speaking. And in kind of the ancient mind, right, the proving ground for men was the battlefield, right? And for women, it was childbirth, right? It was the dangerous thing that your life was sort of built around, right? The very real chance of you dying. And even if that's not the case now, right, that sort of pressure on a society for thousands and thousands of years, right, it's buried deep. And I think that and look, I talked to a lot of GWAT vets, right? Yeah, I've had on you know, any number of guys from that kind of circle on Twitter. And to me, I think that, you know, that kind of that kind of desire is built into people. And, regardless of if you personally like it, it's a part of human nature. There's just like a certain percentage of young men for whom that's what they're kind of built to do. And I don't think you can engineer that out of them.
No, I don't think you can. And I actually think it's a disservice to, I don't know how far to go on that, but like it's a disservice to a certain population to like sort of make a moral equivalency between like that and human sacrifice and stuff, which I see some people doing on the TL, and it's like, okay, I get where you're coming from. Actually, like to some degree, killing is killing, but it's really not. Like young kids signing up to go do the thing that the old men tell them to do is not the same thing as like ripping the heart out of somebody and throwing their head down the steps of some bizarre satanic temple that's fueled by a hallucinogen in, in some jungle. Okay. Like it's just not the same. Right. But the drive, I think, is actually built into all people. And we own this country because we have all of that, but also have, man, this is going to sink a lot of things for me in the future. But the fact is we have the same drive, but we are ruled, we have submitted to God and we are ruled by God. And so even when we're screwing up, we at least still believe that, the man is in charge. Christ is telling us, even if we're being lied to by serpents and whatever, we at least still believe. And so we're restrained in that way. And then we're kind of a little bit better at organizing. And so like, yeah, we can be misled, but that kid that did that went over, the kid that was in Baghdad in 2003 was not going to be sticking obsidian in somebody's heart in, wherever. I just don't buy that part.
Well, look, like, here's my thought. Do you know the YouTuber Brass Facts?
I don't know him personally, but I have seen some of his videos.
So he and I had a really interesting conversation about conflict, right? And his thesis, and one that I think is borne out, right, is that conflict is effectively part of human societies. It's what we do, right? Eventually, some sort of situation arrives where two parties can't come to agreement, and that creates a conflict, right? Now, look, obviously, I'm not saying this is some kind of like war hawk, right? War is obviously, a violent thing. But at a certain level, at the most zoomed out level, right, it's what societies do. And obviously, you'd rather live in a peaceful time than a time, destroyed by war. But I think one of the really weird things about like kind of the modern world is that we turned countries declaring war on each other into like a crime, right? You're not allowed to do that without permission. And no one ever gets permission unless you're one of, the special club. And even then you can't really call it a war anymore. You have to call it a police action or something like that. But again, just as a realist, it seems to me like that's what cultures do. They clash, they rub up against each other. And obviously that is in no way comfort for any individual person who's experienced horrifying loss, displacement, anything. But to me, right, the comparison to human sacrifice is, I don't think that tracks, right? On the most basic level, right? Yes, obviously lives are being lost, but every society goes to war. Not every society commits human sacrifice. And on the other hand, right, there is an opportunity for kind of, and again, I'm speaking out of no experience here, right? But there is an opportunity for kind of a nobility and a heroism in war that you don't see in just like a wanton murder, right? Just a pointless human sacrifice. Sorry, Braxton, I'm kind of rambling, but do you see what
No,
I'm picking at?
I do. I agree with you. That's what I'm saying is I take, I don't like when people make those equivalencies, and I do see them on Twitter, and I think it's ridiculous. And, kind of along these lines, I will tell you, one of the hardest parts of having 3 sons is when they're young. And this is a thing all of my boys are young. When they're young, we tell ourselves this lie that if there may be war, let it be in my time, so that my sons don't experience it, right? But my sons, God willing, are going to have sons one day. You see what I'm saying? So it's like, how do you, that's a big thing to process as an adult, especially when you're holding your 3-year-old boy while he's eating pancakes, right, in the morning. That is in fact a part of human nature, and borders need to be defended, and it kind of is what it is. It's kind of like the whole judge speech that's so famous from Blood Meridian, right? War was here before men.
Yeah, and I don't know. My thought on it, right, is look, like, I come from a certain religious background, right? I'm Calvinist, kind of bone deep. I can't get out of it. And, that kind of conception of the fact that there is a darkness to human nature, right? We are fallen. There's something wrong with us. But, that's true, right? But that's not all there is. And to me, right, like even in something, like war, that's because of the way humans are, that's inevitable. But, there's sort of an opportunity for like a certain type of redemption in it, right? So Calvin has this idea, and you see it elsewhere in a lot of the fascist writings, which I won't cite, but believe me on it, right? That, being a man, in particular a leader of men, requires you to do things that on an interpersonal level would be wrong, right? Would damn you, right? Like if you just, Braxton walked down the street, and shot someone, that would be bad, right? To put it mildly. But if you are a judge, right, and you say, this man is guilty of this crime, and you order him to be shot, it's violence, right? You're still taking the life, but that's the correct thing to do. And the kind of like hyper autistic focus on, well, it produces the exact same output from one narrow variable, right? It's the same thing we were talking about with efficiency in farming. And it's like, well, we live in the real world. There's more than one variable, right? You're not just trying to solve for one thing.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And then all these things kind of have to go into a decision tree. And one of the worst things to kind of circle back to to at least tie into the generalist thing, I actually think this is like part of why our country is struggling the way that it is right now, is the more rounded the person, the more these things make sense, at least to some degree. It's like if you've just always been, let's say you're a JD and you're just been a lawyer for 30 years, and that's a job, right? People can have that. But if you have no other experience, then when you're weighing out decisions that you've got to make based on calls to duty and other things like that, well, then you have this one, you're kind of looking at it through this prism that's pretty narrow, right? And the more that you've seen and the more that you've done, the broader kind of that focal plane is, and maybe not easier, actually probably more difficult. The more things, the grays of the world start to make sense. And I know you said you're a Calvinist, so like gray perhaps is a little bit out the window to some degree, but the broader the focal plane within reason, I think, kind of the better. And that's sort of like where, you want to talk about millennials, where I'm hoping that some of these millennials will be able to grab the reins of power here in this country and exert whatever's left of that American generalist mindset and sort of re-steer the ship, like, so we talked about AOC. I'm rambling at you. I apologize. Go ahead. Go ahead. I'll stop.
No, this is a show for unconstructed rambling.
Okay.
You may notice that my notes to you were three words in no particular order. We basically live by the Bill O'Reilly "We do it live" mantra, so don't worry about it.
Man, it's funny you say that. When you text me or message me that, not text, I told my wife, I was like, "Oh, this guy must be great." This sounds good. So, but AOC, right? If you look at her, she sold herself to her electorate as a bartender, whatever. I mean, we all know that that's probably bullshit. And she was clearly selected by, I forget even the name of it, but it was like actressy stuff here. I forget the name of that.
We all know why she was selected.
Yeah, right. It wasn't because she got a degree in economics from Boston
She's
College.
just so smart.
But within her worldview, to the extent that I can put myself there, she is actually always doing the right thing because her focal plane is so narrow. It's this, people call her a Marxist, which I want to do because it's a useful it's a useful term in a sociological sense. I understand that she's, she's not like steeped in the dialectic, right? Okay. So it's useful in that sense, but within her tight, narrow focal plane, she actually is, again, I'm not saying she's doing this. I'm saying within her focal plane, she's doing the right thing all of the time.
Right. And within the bounded rationality of being like a childless millennial libtard, she's knocking it out of the park.
Exactly. And that's why I think we've got to find a way, or let me phrase it this way. This is why I think the generalist American was such an important, but in some ways underreported part of this. Like, Jefferson was deeply so a naturalist, right? Like, this guy thought there might be dinosaurs, in the Dakotas. He had no idea. Which is in my mind like an endearing thing. He loved all of this stuff enough to know that they had found bones of certain creatures and knew that there was this vast expanse of land that he wanted to have part of this empire. Well, he couldn't have even thought that way. What he did was probably, with the Louisiana Purchase, was probably outside of the scope of the Constitution, but we would not be who we are without it. And he would have not been who he was without being, in some sense, a generalist. And I think it's dangerous to lose that.
Well, you fired me up, so I'm gonna go on a little rant here, right? Go into what you both said about your friend, the immigrant, right? What you said about BLM technically being, from a certain perspective, socialist, and then also Jefferson with this, with the Louisiana Purchase. Here's the thing with ideology. It doesn't exist. It's not real, right? Like, I get it makes you feel good to be perfectly consistent, but that's not how real people act, right? The way that a constitution exists is a description of a people at a time, right? This is what the founding fathers wanted society to be like, right? And I get it, right? For people like us, treating it like this eternal sacred document has worked out well for us, right? We've gotten some wins off of it, right? But this idea that you need to cut off your nose to spite your face, right, to keep yourself ideologically pure and consistent is stupid. And if you doubt me here, look at the libertarians, what few of them are left, right? Autistically arguing about, economists you've never heard of, to an ever dwindling audience, to less and less relevance. And look, simply having an audience does not indicate you're worthwhile, right? That you have anything good to say, right? Obviously. But at the same time, it's like, okay, great. If you have this awesome idea, but you can't convince anyone to follow it, no one is giving you power. No one is giving you the ability to make it manifest. What good does it do you? And, this kind of like hyper fixation on, this perfect ideology is not how our ancestors lived, right? It's like the old Cicero line, right? And I'm going to butcher it. The law goes quiet during a war, right? Which is basically saying, like, when stuff gets real, no one's sitting there quoting, line and verse of, the law of the Constitution, what you will. And again, like going back to what you said, like, to me, it's like that kind of like real interpersonal loyalty comes before these kind of like high and mighty principles. Obviously there's an exception, right? Take your pick, but that kind of personal loyalty is older and realer than, some kind of ideological precept. But I don't know, that's my idea on the thought, or my thought on the idea. I said that backwards, but you know what I meant.
I did. I'm just glad you're doing the mistake for one time. It's usually me. So
this is allegedly an interview show, right? I'm supposed to be listening to you.
I almost called it a typo, but that's how online I am now.
Well, dude, this was a really good time. Thank you so much for coming out. We're almost at our time limit, but if people want to find out more about you, what's the best way for them to do that?
BraxtonMcCoy.com is the best way, and otherwise I'm on X. I've tried to stop calling it Twitter because I kind of think it's just, if he's going to spend $44 billion, I can use the right name. You know what I mean?
No, that's a fair point. It's like that is a whole lot of money to spend for a stupid rebrand. But you know what? The guy can catch a rocket with chopsticks. So you know what? I guess I'm bound to honor his website's pronouns. Well, look, I guess this is another first, because I think this is an entire interview where you never mentioned the fact that you wrote a book.
Oh yeah, no, I did. Yeah. Well, yeah, I wrote a book at one point. I'm working on another one that will cover actually some of this whenever I get around to. But I did write a book called The Glass Factory, and you can get it on the website.
See, this is another thing. We managed to not get into gun autism, which was definitely on the table, right? But I figure my audience probably doesn't want to hear us arguing about minutia, so I figured I'd save that for another time.
Well, you hit me up whenever, because that is actually my favorite thing to do. So, like, I will talk to you about parabolas for as long as you want to talk about them.
Look, Braxton, I can't express to you how dumb I am. I am so dumb. I own an L-can, and I like it.
Oh, dude, one of my good buddies owns an L-can.
It's terminal. I think you're just gonna have to put me down.
Okay. Well, we're gonna have to talk about that at some point. We're gonna bring you into the 21st century here.
Nah. Look, it's a tube. I like it, and I got it for a good deal, and that's really all that matters, right? But anyway, as far as my stuff, the Jay Verdon Show is on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. If you want to support us, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching is the best way to do that. As many of you may have heard, I hit a new PR on bench. Put 20 pounds on my PR in the past like 3 weeks. Basically all thanks to JD. He's very good at what he does, and I recommend his services. Link in the description for that. Again, Braxton, thank you so much for coming out, man.
Yeah, thanks, man. This was fun. Thank you.
And everyone at home, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.